Hey, well, what's up, everyone? Welcome back to The Collision. Daniel here to talk about the latest horror movie from Blumhouse Studios, Five Nights at Freddy's. I've seen it, so let's talk about it. When it comes to things that are supposed to be kid-friendly but are actually terrifying, obviously clowns are forever at the very top of that list, but probably following close behind them are creepy mascots and kind of rickety animatronics. At least that's what Blumhouse Studios is hoping for with their latest horror movie, Five Nights at Freddy's, which is based on kind of the real cult classic, very popular video game series of the same name, which centers on a security guard that's doing night shift duty and kind of an old rundown, shutdown pizzeria arcade a la Chuck E. Cheese, which also happens to be inhabited by five kind of murderous animatronic mascots. And it is a very intriguing premise. It seems like something that is perfectly suited for adaptation into a horror movie. And unfortunately, I don't think this movie is necessarily a total failure. I don't even think it's a bad movie, but it's just a film that never is able to quite kind of elevate itself or become anything more than like the sum of its parts. Because like I said, this isn't a bad movie. Actually, there's a lot of kind of strong, good, kind of individual elements in this movie. There is sort of a fun retro 80s vibe that kind of pulls on the same Stranger Things-esque kind of nostalgia with the music and the visuals. The aesthetics of this definitely pop. Even as someone that's never played these video games, the characters, like these mascots, are all familiar with me. They do have like an iconic look to them, and this sort of, and even like the aesthetics of this sort of pizzeria is just a great setting for a horror movie, and it has a lot of kind of claustrophobic elements, and it's suitably creepy. And Josh Hutcherson of Hunger Games fame is the lead actor in this, and he is more than capable as well. Really, all the acting in this movie is fine, and it's kind of surprising that with all of those kind of individual strong elements, that this film just ends up being so kind of unentertaining and almost dull. And perhaps the biggest problem with this movie is that it stumbles in the one area that a horror movie really has to get right, and that is the horror element. It needs to be a creepy movie. It needs to scare. It needs to unsettle. Because there's just a lot of exposition, there's a lot of backstory, a lot of plot that just keeps getting in the way of this film finding any kind of momentum, and it just sort of detracts from having scenes that do scare and do spook and do build kind of more thrilling moments. And in some ways, I'm kind of of mixed feelings about the horror elements of this movie. I did appreciate that this movie does restrain itself. It opts for this is a PG-13 movie. It's not a R-rated film, and there are which we'll get into, some gruesome violence. There's blood. There is some scenes and visuals that are meant to unsettle and disturb you. But these mostly are either implied or else they happen like just off screen, or it cuts away before the real carnage happens. And it's never really shown as like a desensitizing, bloody spectacle as you might expect from a film like this. Because for the most part, it does try to bring the horror element in with like jump scares and just sort of overall creepy ambiance rather than kind of go for the emotion of disgust with a bunch of gore. So I did appreciate, as someone that is not a fan of gory horror movies, I did appreciate that decision, although I was left quite cold by the actual like execution of that decision. Because it takes about 38 minutes for the sort of animatronic mascots to even appear in full on screen, and then it's even longer than that before they actually start doing something and becoming more of like a menacing threat. And really, they're kind of those moments are split between just two sequences. There's sort of a sequence in the middle where they're sort of going on a rampage with some people in the pizzeria, and then there's the climax of the film where they're all involved, and there's the tension, and those scenes are exciting. The problem is just that everything kind of in between those scenes gets sidetracked by a lot of like the human drama and like trying to be a bit more serious, and just lack some of that kind of foreboding, ominous kind of building tension that it really needed. Because you just don't get sort of that ticking time bomb momentum that that a lot of horror movies are able to pull off, that even if you don't see the monster on screen, you still sort of feel the threat of their presence and you still feel unsettled. This movie is really only thrilling. It's really only scary when those mascots, when those creatures are directly on camera. And obviously, they're just not in this movie nearly as much as I think they should be. Because I found myself kind of engaged and trying to wait to see what happens next, not because I was sort of on the edge of my seat and sort of all tense, but simply because I started counting down the nights spent at Freddy's and assuming at some point before they get to that fifth night, something's bound to happen. I think maybe one other problem with this film is just a somewhat indecisive tone. It's trying to strike a very delicate balance of being kind of embracing the real campy silliness of its premise while also at times trying to be a bit more of a serious drama, a serious horror movie, or even wrestle with some more just sort of meatier or weighty kind of thematic material. And really both of those tones, rather than kind of working together, end up undercutting each other, where you have a film that's trying to be kind of lighthearted, but it's just very rarely funny. And then you have, at the same time, it's trying to be sort of a serious horror movie, and it's just not scary very often. As far as content to consider, kind of things going on the surface of this film, probably a lot less than you might expect from like a horror movie. Again, this is a PG-13 rated film, not an R-rated film, and I do think there was an intentional decision to restrain and not just dump a bunch of content, unnecessary, gratuitous content, to be able to appeal, I think, to a wider audience. Because the language, really not a whole lot. I think there's about 6 sort of minor profanities. There's no F-bombs in this, and not a whole lot of language in this. Sexuality, there's no sexuality to be worried about in this. And violence, like I said, there is definitely violence. This is a horror movie. People get killed. You see those people get killed. You see the aftermath of some of those deaths. But a lot of it is implied. It's discussed, or the camera cuts away before you actually see the gruesome visuals themselves. Although you do see some of those, like there's a character that has a bunch of saws, spinning blades coming towards his face, and is killed, but the camera cuts away. You sort of just hear the screams of that. Another character has his face sort of chewed up by one of these mascot animatronics, and you sort of see it chewing, but you don't necessarily see a bunch of the gore in the moment. Although you do later see that corpse, and you see some of the blood, and it is grotesque, but it's very it's not on screen for more than maybe a second. You have a character that does get bitten in half, which again is a horrifying thing. Although most of that scene happens in, I guess, silhouette. You sort of see the shadows. Although you do see sort of the lower half of this character. The legs fall to the ground and there's blood, but then it cuts away very quick. And you see other characters kind of get stabbed or impaled, but mostly bloodless, never really lingering on these scenes. I mean, one of the things as far as violence is that the plot does center around sort of a serial killer and who targets young children. So there is a lot of, children that have been murdered is part of this plot, although all those events happen before this movie starts. You don't actually see the murders of kids. You don't see that violence, but obviously the implication of that is quite disturbing. There is a lot of talk and stuff to the plot, so maybe just be aware of that as well. Maybe one other thing as far as content is just sort of spirituality, kind of the supernatural, and spirituality does play a role in this film, although it's mostly kind of unexplained, where the spirits of these victims kind of remain in this world, and they're somewhat vindictive, and they're sort of haunting people, and it sort of talks about them, being able to possess these robots, and so there definitely is some of that kind of built into the plot to also maybe just be aware of as well. As far as things going on beneath the surface, sort of themes, worldview stuff with this film, there are a couple kind of thematic threads that weave sort of throughout, although I think much like this film as a whole, it's not always clear. It's a bit ambiguous as far as what the film is actually trying to say about these questions and these issues that it's raising. But maybe the most central kind of question that this film grapples with is this: what is real, what is not real? Because Mike, who's the main character in this film, is very obsessed with dreams. It shows him right at the very start of this film kind of reading a book about the subconscious mind and about dreams, and he's sort of talking to other people about how he feels that in his dreams you can kind of navigate, you can find truth through your memories, and kind of to make sense of some of your trauma and some of your issues. And so he's very much sort of lives in a way in his head. And which also his sister, who's the other sort of main character in this, named Abby, is also shown as very much sort of living in her own head. She has an imaginary friend that is alluded to several times, and at one point her brother sort of chides her and says, "Hey, at least I'm real." And then her aunt, character who also shows up, sort of accuses her of mental illness because she says, hey, she's talking to magical creatures that don't exist, and that's just sort of irrational. So kind of both those characters very much kind of grapple or wrestle with, what is true. And, is your dreams, is in your imagination true? Is the real world true? Is there some kind of combination overlap of the two? And in one sense, both of them get kind of vindicated by the fact that, hey, there are ghosts. There are supernatural forces kind of going on in this movie. But I think overall, this film kind of takes a more negative perspective on that question of what's real and are dreams real and how much in our own kind of brain is real. Because really every character in this film, to one degree, is sort of held captive by their minds. Sort of Mike is held captive by grief and his obsession with dreams. Another kind of ally character, friend in this film, is very much held captive sort of by fear and related to some stuff that happened in her past. And even the ghosts themselves, sort of the spirits, these animatronic creatures, are very much enslaved and kind of in bondage to this sort of false sense of reality that they don't quite remember what happened or how they got there. Again, I don't want to spoil sort of the resolution to some of those conflicts, but sort of in various ways, all of those characters ultimately come to a realization that sort of the perceptive they had in their minds wasn't necessarily reality. It was clouded by pain, by grief, by regret, by fear, and sort of in different ways have to kind of connect with sort of the more tangible truth of their situation, of their circumstances, like in the now, not just sort of dreams or memories of the past. And I think as Christians, that is something that, whether we agree with all how the film navigates that is a question that we can kind of wrestle with. The thought of even this Romans 12:2, where it says, Christians be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so you can be discerning of, what's good, what's beautiful, of kind of God's will, that there is a sense in the Bible that sort of our own perception, our own mind, that we can be held captive by that. And we do need to sort of ground our perception of truth on something tangible, on something real, whether that's God or God's word. So I do think there are some themes in this that Christians can resonate with. But in the end, probably the best description of this film for me would just be unfulfilled potential. This film, there's a great film that is lurking somewhere in all these pieces. There's a lot of things I liked. I didn't hate this film. I wasn't even necessarily bored by this film. Don't think it's a bad film. It's just not a good film. It just doesn't do anything all that well. It's just not as scary. It's not as engaging as I think it definitely could have been had they sort of trimmed some of the drama elements and focused more on trying to build sort of sustained tension. I think I'd even be interested, or at least curious, if they announced a sequel, because I think there is some stuff to build off of. Although I think after sort of this lackluster introduction, for many viewers, I think Five Nights at Freddy's might already prove to be 5 nights too many. But hey, if you guys check out this movie, either if you're a fan of the game and you're excited for this movie, or we're hoping for a good horror movie, would love to hear your thoughts. Jump into the comment section. Let's have a conversation about this. And if you haven't done so, I encourage you guys, subscribe to the channel, become a Collider. We got movie reviews and live streams and just a bunch of other fun stuff. Would love to have you be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thank you for watching. Stay safe and continue to collide through World for Christ.